Our representative will be debating the negative side, and he will be arguing against the existence of God. A former Christian preacher and musician for 19 years, he famously announced his atheism, and has been a figurehead for the movement in America ever since. Currently co-president of the Freedom from Religion Foundation, co-host of Free Thought Radio, and author of 3 books related to the subject of atheism, including Losing Faith in Faith and Godless. A man so famous he has his own Wikipedia page, the charming, charismatic, and ferociously attractive Dan Mark. Now I'd like to introduce you to Dr. JohnMark Miravalle, who is representing the St. Thomas More Society this evening and arguing for the existence of God. He has studied theology at the Franciscan University of Steubenville in Ohio, the Pontifical University of St. Thomas Aquinas in Rome, the Pontifical Faculty of the Immaculate Conception in Washington, D.C., and the Pontifical Faculty Regina Apostolorum in Rome, where he obtained his doctorate. He is the author of the book entitled The Drug, the Soul, and God, a Catholic Moral Perspective on Antidepressants. He is a professor at the School of Faith and has worked at the St. Lawrence Catholic Campus Center here in Lawrence, Kansas for 6 years. Please join me in welcoming Dr. JohnMark Miravalle.
So, it's my job to defend God's existence, which is a weird position to be in, since what I'm really looking forward to is hearing God defend my existence, especially since I don't think I've given him quite as good a case as he's given me. But I have 3 proofs tonight that God exists, one from metaphysics, one from ethics, and one from logic. And the proof from metaphysics has about 3 steps. The first step notices that things have essential features and things have non-essential features. And an essential feature is a feature that a thing has just based on what it is, in virtue of its own internal structure, whereas a non-essential feature is a feature that a thing just happens to have. So I took great care in drawing this triangle for our event tonight, and you will see, I hope you like it, this triangle has 3 sides. Now that's an essential feature of a triangle. A triangle has to have 3 sides just based on what it is. It's part of what it means to be a triangle. But you'll notice too that this triangle is blue. That's a non-essential feature. A triangle doesn't have to be blue, it could just as easily be black or red or green. And you really see this difference between essential and non-essential features come out when people ask questions about them. So for instance, I have a son, he's 3, he'll be 4 tomorrow, and he could come up to me and say, "Daddy, why does that triangle have 3 sides?" And that's a question about an essential feature, and it shows he doesn't quite know what he's talking about. And the only way I can answer his question is if I say, well, son, a triangle has to have 3 sides. That's part of what it means to be a triangle. I have to return again and refer to the thing itself. Whereas if he asks me about a non-essential feature and says, "Daddy, why is the triangle blue?" I say, "Good question. That's a question about a non-essential feature. The triangle doesn't have to be blue. It just happens to be blue. Why is it blue?" And the only way I can answer his question is by referring to something other than the triangle. I say, "Well, son, the triangle is blue because I had a blue marker." You see, so the difference is fairly clear. But now go to step 2, and you will see that the existence of the things in the world is a non-essential feature. For instance, my son, if he came to me and said, "Daddy, why does this triangle exist? Where did it come from? Why does it have existence?" I would answer his question about the triangle's existence, so I'd answer his question about a non-essential feature. I'd say, "Good question, the triangle doesn't have to exist. Why does it exist?" And I'd answer his question by referring to something other than the triangle. I'd say, "Well, the triangle exists because I made it, I drew it, I gave it existence." But then, of course, he could redirect the same question to me. "But Daddy, why do you have existence?" And that's a good question too, because for me, existence is a non-essential feature. I don't have to exist. It's a shame, but I don't have to exist. I didn't exist for a very long time. I won't exist in a few decades, sooner than that if I don't floss, I'm told. And that's true of everything else in the universe. It's a reasonable question to say, why does it exist? And the only way you can answer questions about these things that exist non-essentially, that pass in and out of existence, is by referring to something other than the thing itself. So here's step 3. Step 3 shows that if you want to find an explanation for a non-essential feature, you can only find it in a source of that feature, a source which possesses that feature essentially. So I brought a magnet today. I have all kinds of props, and you'll see the magnet has some, well, I don't know if you can see, but the magnet has some nails and some paper clips. hanging down from it. And they're all magnetized because they're connected to the magnet. Now someone could say, why is that nail right there magnetic? And that's a great question. Because magnetism is a non-essential feature for a nail. Nails don't have to be magnetic. This nail wasn't magnetic before I connected it to the chain from the magnet. And someone could say, okay, well, it's a non-essential feature. Let's answer the question by referring to something other than the thing. Well, this nail has gained its magnetism from this nail above it. Okay, but that just prolongs the question, doesn't it? Because that second nail, that nail right above it, also possesses magnetism as a non-essential feature. You see, so you come to realize that whether you can see it or not, somewhere nearby there has to be a magnet that is supplying, that is acting as a source of the magnetism. There has to be a source of magnetism that itself possesses magnetism essentially in virtue of what it is. And that's what we mean by a magnet. And if someone were to ask, why is the magnet magnetic? It'd be like asking, why does that triangle have 3 sides? The only way you could answer it is by saying, well, that's what the thing is. You have to return again to the thing. This thing is magnetic. This magnet is magnetic based on its own internal structure, based on what it is. But then, if that's how we explain non-essential features, then we have to conclude that the existence, the non-essential existence of all the things in the universe can only be explained by a source of existence which itself possesses existence as an essential feature based on what it is. Where to ask, why does this source exist is like asking, why is the magnet magnetic? Why does the triangle have 3 sides? The only way you can answer that question is to say, well, that's what it means to be the source of existence. It means to have existence essentially. This thing exists based on what it is, based on its own internal structure. And this essentially, necessarily existing source, this thing that has to exist the way a magnet has to be magnetic, the way a triangle has to have 3 sides, this necessarily existing, essentially existing source of existence we call God. And by the way, don't think you can get out of it by appealing to some sort of infinite quantity of things, because that won't help. If I were to say, why is that magnet magnetic? And someone said, well, there's an infinity of magnetized nails. That wouldn't answer the question. The question wasn't how many magnetized nails are there. The question was, where are these magnetized nails getting their magnetism? If I draw a dot on a piece of paper, someone says, where'd that come from? I say, well, I drew it. But supposing it were possible for me to draw an infinity of dots on a piece of paper, and someone says, where'd all those dots come from? And I say, well, there's an infinity of them. That's not the question. The question wasn't how many dots are there. The question is, where did these dots come from? So too, when the question, why do things exist? There can never be a legitimate answer in saying, well, there's an infinity of existing things in the universe. That's not the question. Not how many there are. Where are they getting their existence? And the answer can only be this necessarily existing source of existence that we call God. That's the first proof. The second proof is a proof from ethics. And this proof starts out by noticing that we have moral convictions. Pretty obvious. We all have moral convictions. Let's take one that we all share, I assume. We all know that it's wrong to torture children for pleasure. But here's the question, ready? Here is the question. Where do we get that knowledge from? Where do we get our moral convictions from? There's a couple possible answers. Someone could say, well, we get our moral knowledge by looking out at the natural world, by examining the facts of life. But that doesn't work because the natural world, the facts of life show us what is the case, where our moral convictions are about what ought to be the case, and there's a clear dissymmetry there. Those two don't line up. The facts of life, the natural world, shows us that it is the case that some people torture children for pleasure. Whereas our moral convictions tell us that it ought not to be the case that some people torture children for pleasure. So they don't line up. You can't get your moral convictions by looking out at the natural world because the natural world doesn't show you a moral picture. So someone might say, well, let's try this. Maybe we get our moral convictions from within ourselves. Maybe our moral convictions are expressions of our own desires, choices, preferences, instincts. But that doesn't work either, for a couple of reasons. One is, you notice we're always very careful to show that the truth of our moral convictions is independent of our own personal situation. If I see someone torturing a child, I say, stop. He might say, why? Don't you like it? Don't you choose to live this way? I say, well, of course I don't like it, don't choose to live that way, but that's not the point. There's lots of things I don't like, don't choose to do. I don't like or choose to eat peanut butter and mustard sandwiches. But I wouldn't tell someone to stop. I wouldn't say, don't eat peanut butter and mustard sandwiches, it's wrong. You see, I'm not telling you to stop torturing children because I have a problem with it, but because it's sick and it's wrong and you mustn't do it. Also notice this. When our desires, preferences, choices, instincts are frustrated, what do we feel? We feel disappointment. Whereas, when our moral convictions are frustrated, what do we feel? We feel moral indignation and outrage, and those two are not the same. I may apply for a job and get turned down for it. And I may be disappointed. But I don't necessarily feel outraged. Maybe that was the right decision. Maybe I just wasn't a good fit for the job. Or I may go looking for cookies in the cupboard, find there aren't any. I'm disappointed, but I don't become indignant. Nothing evil happened. Just no cookies. Bummer. Whereas when my moral convictions are frustrated, I feel indignation. I feel that something wrong, something evil has happened. You see, so they can't be the same because the experiences that we have when each one is frustrated are vastly different. So someone might say, well, our moral convictions are determined by the larger culture as a whole, right? Society at large, the given authority figures in any given age, any given setting, that's what determines our sense of right and wrong. That obviously doesn't work either for two reasons. One is, if that were the case, we could never meaningfully talk about social progress, right? We could never say that we've become more ethical, say, in our treatment of women, in our treatment of minorities. Because to be able to say that presupposes that you can take two cultures side by side and compare them against some other standard and say, yeah, this culture is doing better than that one on this issue. And we obviously say that, which shows that the culture can't be its own standard. There must be some other standard that we can compare cultures against. Also notice this, if the culture was what determined our sense of right and wrong, then the very idea of social reform would be a contradiction in terms. Because social reform happens when an individual or a small group of people stand up for what is right against the culture at large, against the general social ethos. But if the general societal ethos was what determined what was right, you could never stand up for what is right against it. But that's precisely what happens. We applaud those people who are brave enough to stand up for what is right, even against the mob, even against the large group, which shows that the large group isn't what determines what's right. That rules out a lot of options, right? We've ruled out, as a source of our moral convictions, we have ruled out the natural world, we have ruled out ourselves, and we have ruled out other people. What's left? Well, some source that goes beyond, that transcends ourselves, that transcends other people, and that transcends the natural world, and this transcendent moral source, this transcendent source of our sense of right and wrong, we call God. The final proof is a proof from logic, and this one starts out by noticing that being is that which is, and non-being is that which is not. So being is what exists, what is real. Non-being is what does not exist and is not real. So I am a being, you're all a being, the podium is a being. Unicorns are non-being because they don't exist. So here's the important point to get. Non-being does not exist by definition. There is no non-being. So far so good, but now go to step 2 and you will see that therefore being must be infinite. Because if being came to an end, if being had a limit, then it would be natural to say, well, what's after that? What's on the other side of that limit? And then you only have two options. You can say, well, after that, on the other side of that limit is more being. But then, of course, it's not really a limit, right? Because being doesn't really come to an end. Being continues on uninterrupted. Or you could say, well, after that, on the other side of that limit, there's non-being. Ooh, you said non-being. There is non-being. You can't say that. Right? To say there is non-being, to say that non-being exists on the other side of that limit in any way, in any respect, that's to contradict yourself. Because you're saying that that which does not exist, exists, and you don't want to contradict yourself at a reason test. So, the conclusion must be that being is infinite. But if being is infinite, then being is also perfect, because imperfection comes from missing something. For instance, if you get a 99% score on a test, that's a good score. But it's imperfect. Why? Because you're missing that 1% of the right answer. But if you're infinite, you can't be missing anything, so you can't have any imperfection, so you have to be perfect. Therefore, this infinite being is perfect, and this infinite perfect being we call God. And by the way, since you can't add to infinity, whatever Buzz Lightyear may tell you, our being, our existence, is no addition to the infinite perfect existence of God. Rather, our existence is a limited, finite share in the perfect, infinite being of God. So this infinite perfect being, who allows us to be by allowing us to share in a limited way in his being, in a finite, imperfect way in his infinite perfect being, we call God. So that's a pretty good start, I'd say. We've proven that there has to be a necessarily existing source of all the existence that we see around us. We've shown that there has to be a transcendent, a source that transcends the world, ourselves, and other human beings, a source of morality, of our moral convictions. Right, that's what I mean by morality, our moral convictions. And also that there has to be an infinite, perfect being who allows us to be by sharing in his being. So notice this. The first proof shows that if God doesn't exist, if God doesn't exist, things are inherently inexplicable. But reason could never help us explain what's inherently inexplicable. The second proof shows that our sense of good and bad, our sense of value, depends on God's existence. And we could never assign value to reason. We could never say that reason was good if we didn't have a sense of value or good at all. And finally, the last proof shows that if God doesn't exist, things break down into absurdity, into contradictions, into senselessness. And if things are senseless, then reason can't help us make sense of things. The point is that reason depends on God for its operations, to fulfill its functions. Reason depends on God to do what it does. At a Reason Fest, the one we should really be celebrating is the one who makes it all possible. That is God. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Dan Barker will now have his opening statement, 15 minutes. As a quick note, if you could please keep the aisles cleared in case of any emergencies. Thank you.
So this Catholic priest takes a rabbi to a boxing match. And one of the boxers makes the sign of the cross, and the rabbi turns to the priest and said, "What does that mean?" And the priest said, "Not a damn thing if you can't fight." Yesterday was the National Day of Prayer, and of course we all know that nothing fails like prayer. We all know that. How many prayers have been said forever and they have not been able to keep praying for God's blessing and nothing changes. Nothing. If there were a God, you would think there would be some evidence for that. Thank you, JohnMark. Very eloquent. Nice to meet you. Thank you, Conrad. Thank you, Soma and St. Thomas More Society. And thank all of you for coming. The fastest growing religion in the United States it's not a religion at all. Do you know what it is? The fastest growing religion right now is non-religion. Millions of good Americans, including a bunch of people in this audience, do not believe in a God and yet live happy, moral, productive, meaningful, purposeful, loving, full lives. We don't need that belief in a God. Some people do feel like they need a belief in a God to do exactly what JohnMark is doing, to plug the gaps. The God of the gaps is the arguments basically, except for his first one, that was different. That ontological one's good. But during my rebuttal, I will talk about what's wrong with his arguments. But millions of us have realized that this God belief can be explained in totally natural terms. Those of you who believe in a God, you don't have a God. You have a belief in a God. Theism is a belief, and atheism is simply the absence of that belief for whatever reason. I used to believe, as you know, I was a preacher, and I really did feel it. I dedicated my life to it. It was wonderful. I loved Jesus. I felt the presence of God within me. In fact, even today, I won't do it here, but I can go back behind the barn and pray in tongues, and I can reproduce all those feelings. It feels pretty neat. It's like the presence in the brain. There's this goosebumps that I get. Of course, when I was a believer, I didn't realize that goosebumps are not evidence of the Holy Spirit. Goosebumps are evidence of evolution. Did you know that? Why do we get goosebumps? Because our hairy ancestors used it for thermal control and to scare off an attacker. And when do you get goosebumps? When you're cold and when you're scared. So, but I didn't know it at the time. I thought we were created by God and that goosebumps had some spiritual reasoning to it. But I changed my mind, and I can't tell you that story tonight. You can read my book, Godless, which explains why, after 19 years of fervently believing and feeling it and seeing what I was convinced were miracles and living a daily life by faith, that I rejected it. The motivation that drove me into the pulpit was to know and to speak the truth. The same motivation drove me out. Christianity is not true. The Bible is not reliable. The arguments for a God are not good arguments. The main reason, and I'll give you a number of reasons as time allows, if there is a God, there should be some evidence for this God. We shouldn't have to rely, as JohnMark did, to God of the gap, logical or what if, or how do you explain that kind of argument? That's what people have been doing for centuries. There was noises and lights in the sky. What is it? And then the waterfalls. It must be some animal or creature or god or being. Let's call it Thor. Let's call it Zeus. What is it? It's this thing up there. We don't know. The god of the gaps. Well, now we know something about electricity. We know something about the weather. And Thor and Zeus have died. They've been tossed into the trash bin of history. Although we do have a day of the week for Thor, don't we? Thursday. And we don't have a Jesus Day, do we, in this country? So those gods have died. They're gone because that gap has closed, and we no longer need to invent some kind of a supernatural answer for an as yet unanswered question of science. Yes, science has a lot of gaps. That's what drives science. If there were no gaps, there would be no science. Science thrives on trying to answer unanswered questions. And yet every question that comes along, theologians think, see, we don't have an answer. Science can't answer that, therefore, God. Right? God always hides in these gaps. But notice that JohnMark did not bring us any evidence for this God. It's always negative stuff. How do you explain this? Who pops up the next Kleenex? Have you thought about that? It's like what, how do you explain that? And then you can just fold your arms and say, see, our God, by definition, is the answer to those questions. If there were evidence for a God, think about this. If there really were evidence for a God, by now someone should have won the Nobel Prize for pointing that out. Any scientist in the world would love to say, here it is, folks, we've solved this. But all you have is faith. You don't have a God. You have a bunch of words, words, words. You have theologians. Theology is a subject with no object. Theologians are basically studying theologians. They're not studying a real thing. They're not providing evidence for a real thing. And by the way, we sometimes hear it said that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. That's not true. Absence of evidence is certainly not proof of absence, but absence of evidence is evidence of absence. What if there were a bomb threat? And the authorities came and said, we have to get out of this building quick. We would go outside, the authorities would come in, they would do their job, and after a while they would announce, okay, it's clear, you can come back again. Would you come back in? I would. They would have gone through the building, they would have looked here, looked at the trash cans, looked at everything. They might have had a chart or a list of some sort, or a diagram, whatever they do to make sure that the building is clear. That diagram you can hold in your hands is evidence of absence. It doesn't prove there was no bomb, but it's evidence of absence. We have looked for a God, we've looked for evidence for centuries and centuries, and there is none. Especially the Bible. If you're going to use the Bible as an evidence for God, that's the worst thing you could possibly use. Beyond that, there's no coherent definition of a God. Notice that JohnMark didn't really define God in any positive terms. He just said it's some kind of ontological essence of beingness, whatever that happens to mean. But believers can't even agree among themselves about the definition of this being that they're asking us non-believers to believe in. It'd be like getting up and arguing for the existence of a married bachelor. You have to believe in this married bachelor. And we can say, well, that not only does such a being not exist, such a being cannot exist. It's mutually contradictory. Many of the definitions of the God, especially the God of Christianity that have been proffered, contain contradictory characteristics like married bachelor. For example, a being who is a personal being, like the God JohnMark believes in, who is free to make decisions, cannot know the future, cannot know his own future. Such a being is a married bachelor. It cannot exist because it takes away his freedom if he knows his future actions. There are many other ways to show that there are mutually incompatible properties of this God that no one has even defined, and John certainly hasn't even proffered a definition of this being that he's arguing for. And another point is that there are no good arguments. We've heard an ontological and a moral argument tonight, and there are about a dozen arguments that apologists have put forth. First cause, which are cosmological. There are also teleological, and John didn't touch on the design argument. I think maybe, I'm suspecting that he knows it's a bad argument. The apparent design within nature should point to a designer. But of course we can see that the designer has to be at least as complex and interesting as the thing that is designed, and if the object needs a designer, then so does the designer. You get into an infinite regress with these arguments. There are also the other types of ontological arguments that Bertrand Russell, when Bertrand Russell was a teenager, He was very briefly convinced that the ontological argument proved the existence of God. But then he woke up the next morning and he said, they're all just bad grammar. He put these arguments, the arguments contain unexamined assumptions, or they beg the question. The premises themselves contain the very conclusion that you're arguing for, which is what happens in some of these teleological design and cosmological arguments. It's really just assuming the very thing you're trying to prove. And if God, and John hasn't defined his God, but I presume being Catholic, he believes that God is good because he's giving us this moral argument that somehow has been implanted within us, which I'll talk about during the rebuttal. If this God is good, then how do you account for the problem of evil? All theologians admit that's the thorniest problem. If there's a good God, why doesn't he stop evil? Why doesn't he answer prayers? Why doesn't he care? All you have to do is walk into any children's hospital and you know there's no God. You know it. You see it. Those parents are desperately praying. They love their kid. Maybe they're good churchgoers, a good prayer, and they're wanting God's blessing, and God bless America, and please. And those kids die at the same random rate as anyone else. There is no God who appears to care about anyone's life, who appears to answer prayers. And why not? If there were this God who was the source of morality, then why is there all this, not only moral evil, but natural evil, as we see throughout the cosmos? The needless suffering, the nature red in tooth and claw of evolution, all of this horribleness that's going on in the world, in this universe that is not so beautifully created. There's so much beauty in the cosmos, but there's so much ugliness as well. So I would like to see John at least address something. I know there are about 6 theodicies that have come up with Hicks's soul building or character building, but I would like to see you at least offer some defense to the problem of evil. Why doesn't God care, and why is it that your prayers go unanswered? And Paul wrote in the New Testament, not that I believe Paul, but he wrote this, God is not the author of confusion. But can you think of a single book that's caused more confusion than the Bible? Look at that. All these groups. Catholics were killing Protestants. Protestants were killing Catholics. The initiation of the 30 Years' War in Europe was over Catholics and Protestants. Should you baptize infants or not? Each side knew that they had the right answer. Each side could open the book and could prove that everyone else was wrong. All these Christian denominations, each one of them can prove, and I used to think I could prove, I had the way to properly discern the word of truth. I knew what it really meant when I read it, and the others were off in some way. And look at the dissensions, look at the fighting, look at the holy wars, look at the history of religious bloodshed that's still going on even now. If there is this all-powerful being, he doesn't seem to care very much. He seems pretty sloppy, doesn't he? If he's the source of moral authority, then why did he only give the ultimate absolute moral authority to JohnMark? Why is he the only person who happens to know that? And all these other denominations and groups fight with each other. There's no agreement about this nature of this deity that people are arguing for, nor is there any agreement about the moral principles of this deity. You take any social issue that we're struggling with right now, you name it. Name a few. Stem cell research, gay rights, abortion rights, women's rights, constitutional rights, death with dignity, marijuana use, the war, torture, you name it. All these things that society is struggling with, you find devout, Bible-believing Christians and devout Jews on both sides of that issue. You see them marching in different marches. There is no moral beacon in the Bible. There is no absolute moral compass that we all have on these issues, because you disagree with probably half this crowd about many of those issues, and yet you claim that you have this source of moral authority that is guiding your life. There's something arrogant about it when I was a preacher, thinking that I was the one that God was telling what was the true moral authority. What it really boils down to, it's just your own subjective moral feelings. I'll talk about morality during the rebuttal. So, there's no evidence for a God. Absence of evidence is evidence of absence, although it's not proved. There's no coherent definition of a God that believers agree on. There's no way to even falsify the statements, and I'll talk about that also during cross-examination. There's no good argument for a God. There's no good defense to the problem of evil. There's no agreement among believers about this being that they're all arguing for. And there's no need for a God. It is more reasonable not to hold a belief in such an irrational idea of this being that transcends the natural world and somehow gives our lives meaning. Meaning does not come from above. If meaning came from above, if meaning came from a transcendent world above us, then there's no meaning. We don't have meaning. We are secondary. We are servants. We are slaves. We are fitting in the universe in some secondary way. Those of us who don't believe in God realize that the meaning and the purpose in our lives that we make for ourselves is much more important, much more beautiful, much more awe-inspiring than any pretense or delusion of a supernatural creator.
Thank you, both of you, for powerful and thought-provoking arguments. Things are only going to get more exciting and fast-paced as we go. Next is rebuttals. As you listen, think about points that you would like brought up that were not brought up. Write those down on your question cards, which we'll be asking for shortly. First up for rebuttal is, again, Dan Barker. You have 8 minutes.
The essential feature of a blue triangle is that it have 3 sides and that it be blue. Right? Otherwise, you don't have a blue triangle. You can define anything you want into existence and then define what you want it to be essential or not. In fact, a triangle is just a subset. A triangle is just a polygon. A triangle is not an essential polygon. What is the essential feature of a polygon? It has to have 3 or more sides to it. So, you're playing with words here by trying to say that there are features that are essential or not. We decide for ourselves what we think is going to be the thing we're calling essential. So you could say the essential feature of a multicolored polygon is that it be a polygon with multicolors. You can talk all you want. That's why Bertrand Russell was talking about bad grammar. You're trying to bring things into existence that are just mental constructs for the way that we view the world. You made an amazing statement during your opening statement. You said that existence is a non-essential feature of something. But existence is not a feature. Existence is not a characteristic. You cannot have a feature of anything unless it is a thing, unless it exists. Existence is not something that you have. It is not something you possess. It wouldn't be like, oh, I have this skin color, I have this hair color, I have this height. Oh, by the way, I also have existence. You're confusing with words. You're comparing apples and oranges. You are equivocating. That's the word I'm looking for. You're equivocating by thinking that existence somehow is a characteristic or a feature of a thing that exists. How can existence be a feature of a thing that exists? It has to exist. It has to be a thing before. Then you can start saying that there are features to it. What about a block of iron that's not magnetized, but you run a current through it? Is it essentially a magnet or not? It's a magnet when the current's running through it. It's an electromagnet. But is that an essential feature? Suppose the magnet you were holding up here were actually an electromagnet. It's the same idea. So to say that magnetism is an essential feature of a magnet is just to say that there's been an electromagnetic current or an alignment of the molecules within that medium. And then you say God exists infinitely, and yet infinite things can't exist. Well, which way is it? If you can't have an infinite existence of things, then how can God even exist? Because He is, by your definition, an infinitely existing thing. But I want to talk more about morality, because that's, I think, where most of us live our lives. You are wrong on all those counts about morality. Yes, we can find morality within nature, and we do find morality within nature. Thomas Jefferson wrote a letter asking if God is the source of morality, how do you explain all the virtuous atheists that are in the world? And he named a bunch of them. Condorcet, D'Alembert. These are good men, and they are atheists, and they don't believe in God. Morality must have some other source than God, and he was right. He thought it was instinct, and actually he predated Darwin. He predated evolution, and he was pretty much right. We do have altruistic instincts that we share with other creatures. Other animals have altruism and empathy and cooperation. They sacrifice for each other. They have cross-species cooperation with each other. The work of Franz de Waal and others pointing out that we are not the only species that have these moral impulses within us. We share them with other animals because we are animals. We have instincts that came to us from the minds of our ancestors. The decisions that our ancestors made that leaned towards survival, we inherited, and therefore, I was in the Detroit airport about 20 years ago, and I wasn't even looking, but the corner of my eye saw this little baby kick, and the baby carrier rolled off the top of the luggage to fall down to the hard marble floor. I saw my arm stretch and reach over, and I caught that thing with my fingertips. And a second later, the mother caught it too. And we were both like, whoa, that was scary. I wasn't contemplating Jesus. I wasn't thinking about God. I wasn't even noticing it. Just my instinctive reach. And you would have done the same thing, right? You instinctively would have done it. We come pre-packaged with moral impulses from our natural ancestors. We also do get some guidance from the law. The law is not always perfect, and the law is flexible. We do get some guidance from the combined wisdom of our society, which can help us. Sometimes are bad laws, but in general, we should at least consider the laws. And of course, the primary way to be a moral person is not through thinking that this being is putting these impulses within you. It's through reason. It's through thinking. The reason why certain actions are wrong, like torturing a baby for no reason, is not that there's some cosmic absolute code. Because what if God said it's okay to torture babies? In fact, in the Bible, God did say that, and I will quote that to you during cross-examination. If God said it's okay to kill babies, then would it be okay? We have moral impulses not because of some absolute moral standard, but because of harm. The principle is harm. If your intention is to act in a way that minimizes real harm in the real world, that's what morality means, if you're mentally healthy. Some people are not. There's probably some people in this room who might be at the edge of the bell curve of who knows what. And we have systems of law in prison. Most of you are good people. You're way over here on this side of it. We inherit from our ancestors natural altruistic instincts. We get from our society guidance in the form of law. And using reason, you look at your actions, you say, should I torture this baby or shouldn't I? My goodness, what should I do? Well, which action results in less harm? Usually moral dilemmas are a conflict of values, and you might have to pick the lesser of two evils or try to weigh it. But if you are acting in a reasonable way to determine the likely consequences of the actions you are contemplating, and you are weighing them with the intention of committing an action that results in the least amount of real harm. Harm is physical. Harm is natural. A moral decision is a natural, materialistic decision. It's not some foggy, Jesus tell me what to do thing. It's using your brain and using your reason to come to an informed... And if you're wrong, well, you learn from that, hopefully, and you will grow, and you try to be as informed as you can. So the harm principle obviates the need for some transcendent being. And I guess we're almost out of time. We talked about whether unicorns exist. I think most of us don't believe in unicorns or leprechauns, although I had a box of Lucky Charms the other day and I saw evidence for leprechauns. But some people say, well, you don't believe in unicorns, why don't you call yourself an a-unicornist and go up and do debates about unicorns? Well, if the unicornists were working to limit human freedom and women's rights and gay marriage and science and stem cell research, and if they were fighting against freedom and equality, well, then I would be an a-unicornist, just as I am an atheist, because on balance, theism, for all the good that theists do, on balance, theism is more of a negative and more of a danger to the world that should be resisted. We're going to go into rebuttals now, right? Your rebuttal. Yeah.
compliment about eloquence. That certainly means a lot coming from such an experienced and accomplished speaker as yourself. So thanks. There was a lot that was discussed that I don't think we came here to discuss, so I'm not going to address specifically things like the efficacy of prayer, certainly all the political issues that were mentioned, and certainly not scriptural exegesis or Christian history. While I would obviously be pleased to engage in another debate about those issues, and I think they're important ones, we came today to talk about God's existence, and I'd like to mention a few of those issues. One is, Dan started out by saying I didn't give any evidence for God's existence. Now, I know you all know this, but let me just repeat very clearly. The way an argument works is you start from something that is immediately known, and you proceed to something that is not immediately known. That's the way every argument works. And what is immediately known, that counts as evidence. And it is immediately known that being is that which is, and non-being is that which is not. It is immediately known that we have moral convictions, and it is immediately known that things exist and they don't have to. And that's the source. That is the evidence which led us to the fact that God exists. There was just one small point. Dan mentioned if someone had proven God's existence, they would have won the Nobel Prize. I looked this up, actually. The Nobel Prize was first given in 1901. So the problem was, poor Thomas Aquinas and Anselm and Blessed John Henry Newman, they were all dead before they could get their Nobel. It doesn't really undermine the validity of their arguments. It's kind of like saying, well, Darwin must have been wrong because a poor guy died right before getting that award. It certainly doesn't undercut any of their arguments or their contributions. I didn't give a definition of God seems strange to me because I said he was a necessarily existing source of existence, that he was perfect. I don't know which of those words don't work, and that he was moral and good. I mean, those all sound like positive words to me. Dan mentioned that a lot of theists disagree about God. Well, as I'm sure a lot of you know, a lot of literary critics disagree about The Tempest. I've read, I think there's about, 1,000 critical essays regarding Shakespeare's plays, The Tempest, what it's about, what the point of it is, who it was written for, when it was written, even who it was written. So, going on the idea that if you disagree about something that doesn't exist, we have to throw The Tempest out. The Tempest must just be a delusion. But obviously that's not true. Disagreement is not the measure for existence or non-existence. God doesn't know the future. I think you'll find that the more philosophical theists you read, the more they're in agreement that God exists in an eternal present, which means he doesn't really have a future. He just has a continual now. He is eternal, which means present at all time at once, which means he doesn't have to see ahead. So there isn't really any conundrum with regard to God's knowledge. And technically, whenever you hear an objection based on divine foreknowledge, know that that's an imprecision in speech. God has knowledge of what he sees now at all times. All right, the second speech, the rebuttal, I think it's pretty clear that the phrase, the triangle is blue, or the blue triangle is blue, is a really different phrase from the three-sided triangle is three-sided. The blue triangle is blue may be true, but it's not necessary. It might surprise us, really, it is blue. Whereas if someone came and said, the three-sided triangle is three-sided, we say, well, no kidding. Because that's a necessary truth, based on the factual reality, based on the real essence of what a triangle is. You see, there's a big difference, and everybody knows it, between essential features and non-essential features. Dan tried to say that wasn't a valid distinction. I don't see how you could say that, because otherwise you'd have to say that the statement, the blue triangle is blue, is exactly of the same quality as the statement, the three-sided triangle is three-sided, and that's obviously false. One gives us new information. Information about what is factual but not necessary. The other gives us information about what we already knew, just by understanding the words we're using. Okay? So, And that was it. I think that was his only objection to my first argument, so I have nothing else to defend of the first argument. So, it seems pretty sound so far. I didn't say infinite things couldn't exist. I never said that. That was the other objection. That was the only other objection, was that I said that God is infinite, but I also said infinite things couldn't exist. I never said infinite things couldn't exist. I said if you say there's an infinite quantity of things possessing a non-essential feature, that doesn't explain where the non-essential feature present in that infinite quantity of things came from, you see? And that's a very different point, and both of those points are valid. We've proven that being must be infinite. I didn't hear any disproof of that argument. And we've proven that the non-essential feature of existence of however many things are on the universe, whether finite or infinite, requires an explanation that can only be provided by a necessarily existing source that we call God. Finally, morality. How am I doing on time? I got 2 minutes. Let's try it. Certainly, first of all, certainly, you can live on your moral convictions and ignore God. The way some college students I hear, I'm sure none of you, live on their parents' credit card and ignore their parents. It's certainly a possibility of human life. It's just very inconsistent. So too, an atheist can live on the moral convictions that come from God and yet ignore God, or be ignorant of God. My kids live on, I have little kids, and they live on meat and vegetables, and they don't know anything about butchers and farmers. I don't even know if they know they exist. They will know they exist as they mature, which is why I think theism is such a more mature way of thinking and way of living than atheism. Minimizing harm. Minimizing harm. Come on. I have 1 minute left. Minimizing harm doesn't answer the question of why we know not to do bad things. It just rephrases it. Dan says, the way we know not to do bad things is that we know to minimize harm. Well, that's just saying the same thing 2 different ways. The way we know not to do bad things is that we know to minimize harm, which just means bad things. Right? And I'm asking, how do you determine what counts as a bad thing? And there's been no evidence offered for any alternative source that is even conceivably possible, besides a transcendent moral source. And by the way, harm isn't just physical. Harm can also be transphysical. When I'm afraid in my public speaking, I'm not afraid you people are going to bite me if I do a bad job. I'm afraid of these abstract notions like shame and failure, which I'm happy to say it doesn't seem is happening so far. So thanks so much.
Now it's time for possibly the most exciting portion, the cross-examination. If you have questions written down on your cards, now is the time. Please pass them to the aisles, these 2 aisles. Our runners will pick them up and bring them where they need to go. Please pass those in now. We're going to go right into cross-examination, though. So while you're doing that, please continue to give your attention. Ladies and gentlemen. First, for cross-examination, JohnMark Miravalle. You have 5 minutes. Please address your questions to Dan Barker.
Great, thanks. Can everybody hear me? Do I get more time?
Yes.
We good? No. Testing 1, 2, 3. Okay, I'm clicking my little clock. So Dan, I know you're familiar with the law of excluded middle, which says that if you have 2 comprehensive categories, there's no possible alternative for a different category. So there's 2 mutually comprehensive categories, things that don't have to exist and things which must exist necessarily. I'm asking, what other possible explanation can there be for the existence of things that don't have to exist?
I think the very phrase, things that don't have to exist, is a conceptual phrase that's not referring to anything in reality. Our brains can come up with all sorts of concepts that don't exist in reality. And we can even make words for them. So in order for your question to have any meaning at all, I have to know what it means I have to know what you mean by that phrase, things that don't exist. So it's a question that can't even be answered until it's defined properly.
Well, let me try this, and this is a quote from your book, and maybe you've changed your mind. I don't mean to imply that you still think this, but on page 109 you said this. You said, life as we know it, humans for example, did not have to evolve. Now that seems to indicate an insight of yours, and I would say a very true one, that certain things in the universe, for instance living things, do not have to exist.
Yeah, but what's the point? I mean, they don't.
So it seems that you're very familiar with the type of ideas I'm using.
I know. I've just said to you that there are many things that we can conceptualize that don't exist in reality.
So you're saying what you said does not reflect reality at all? Just some quirks of your mind?
A concept is a real thing. A functioning brain functions in a way that it produces concepts within that brain. So that concept is a real thing, and it does exist.
Good. Does it correspond to extra-mental reality?
But if I have a concept of something that doesn't exist, the concept is what we're talking about that's real. So I don't know what you're talking about. How can there be a non-existing thing that has some meaning to it?
Well, I don't know. You seem to say that life could be non-existing in that quote. Is that not what you said?
Well, yeah, we could have been in a universe where life never evolved.
Bingo.
Right?
Yeah, exactly. So things don't have to exist. The things in this universe don't have to exist. We recognize the truth of that. That means there's only one possible alternative explanation. It means the terms I'm using make sense. What could be that explanation for these things which you know in the universe don't have to exist?
Well, for one thing, life is not a thing. It's
living
a function.
things. Living things.
Living things are just the same matter and the same stuff. That stuff exists within our universe. The atoms, the molecules, those things exist. Their arrangement of them in a functional, complex arrangement of them are what we call life, and that is a concept.
Yeah, but now you're talking about the meaning of life. I want to talk about the existence or non-existence, which you recognize as a real possibility for things like living things in the universe.
And when I made that comment, I wasn't saying that just if humans don't exist, then no life would exist. There could have been some other form of life other than humans.
Exactly,
right?
Exactly.
So what's the point?
The things that exist don't have to exist. We both seem to agree on that. There's only one possible conceptual explanation for the things that don't have to exist, and that is something that has to exist that serves as a source of that existence. What's the alternative? You're saying the words don't make sense, but then you seem to say that they do by using them about reality.
If a functioning brain did not exist, there would not even be a concept of those functioning brains that don't exist. So the fact that we do have functioning brains, the whole idea of a non-existent thing is a concept. A non-existent thing is not a non-existent thing. It's a concept in our brains, is what it is.
Okay. I feel like my point's pretty simple, and I haven't understood how you've responded to it. The point is that certain things in the universe exist, but don't have to. That means their existence is non-necessary, non-essential. We've both agreed about that. So why do they exist? That's a good question.
Well, you could ask the same question about God.
No, you couldn't, because
yes,
God is the alternative. We've already said. As we've defined God, it's like asking the same question about the magnet. Why is the magnet magnetic? It has to be magnetic. Why does the triangle have 3 sides? It has to have 3 sides. God is that which we have concluded must exist.
Then why can't we just say that the universe is that which we take as a brute fact?
Oh, good, easy. Because the universe is made up of things that don't have to exist, so it'd be like adding a bunch of blue M&Ms and then saying, well, but the group of blue M&Ms is green.
Well, it seems to me you're bringing your conclusion into your premise then, because you are asserting a being that doesn't have to exist in advance to make an argument that such a being does exist. You're dividing the world into two separate concepts.
I think our time's up.
Is it an essential feature of a polygon that it have 3 sides?
No, unless it's a triangle.
There you go. So for a polygon to exist, it doesn't have to be a 3-sided figure. So 3-sidedness is not an essential feature of a polygon.
Unless it's a triangular polygon.
So if I were to say the same thing, a blue triangle In order for a blue triangle to exist, to be an essential feature of a blue triangle is that it have three sides and be blue.
But that's not
we're
true.
defining what a blue triangle is. You're defining a three-sided polygon. You're just picking your words to think that three-sidedness is somehow, by definition, an essential feature of that thing, when I could just add...
If it's
You
a
know what I'm
triangle, it is. Are you saying there's no real triangles? And
No,
that triangles that are real don't have three sides?
Are you saying there are no blue triangles?
No,
Of course there are blue
here's
triangles.
one. But I don't see why it has to be blue.
Are you telling me that an argument is an evidence?
I'm saying an argument is based on evidence or it's not worthy of the name.
But when I ask for evidence for God, you're giving me evidence for our existence, and you're giving me evidence for moral things, but you're not giving me, what is God made of?
No.
What is he defined of? How much space does he occupy? How much does he weigh? How would God differ from a non-God? How do you define? What evidence can you give, not to answer these unanswered questions, but what evidence can you give for your God? What is it like?
I think you misunderstood the direction of the proofs. I wasn't providing evidence that things exist. That we know. That things exist was the evidence I provided for God, which now we know too.
But you were responding to my rebuttal, which was rebutting your claim. So, maybe
Sorry, I didn't get that last one.
Does this bottle mean there's a God?
Yeah. Yeah, that's the proof.
And what is this being God thing? What is it made of? Is God made of spirit?
God is
Bible
what
says-
I've told you he is. He's
Is he made of spirit?
completely perfect.
Is he a spirit?
Yeah. Well, let me explain that.
Okay,
Because
well, like, define spirit.
you
then.
bet.
Define
Something
it.
with intelligence and freedom.
That's what spirit is?
Oh yeah, man.
So,
And by the way, because God is infinitely perfect, he has to have the perfections of intelligence and freedom. And I'd say that in America we know freedom is a perfection. And at a university we know that intelligence and understanding are perfections, right? Probably not too much controversy on that one. So this infinitely perfect being has got to possess the perfections of intelligence and freedom, which is all I mean by spirit.
by definition, right? But not by any evidence that you have offered us of that being. You offered us evidence for gaps in our understanding, but you've not actually admit it, you don't have evidence for the being itself.
I don't see any gaps in our understanding. I think the understanding is pretty clear. We have evidence. You haven't shown where I took a misstep on any rational course. You just say, I don't accept that evidence. Well, show me why.
But it's an evidence for a plastic bottle is just evidence
I'm not
for
giving
a
an
plastic
evidence
bottle.
for plastic bottles. I'm starting with the
What if I
fact
said-
of the plastic bottle.
Folks, I have evidence for unicorns. It's right here. Here it is. Is this evidence for unicorns?
I'd like to, before you can make that right parody, you have to make a good argument from the bottle to the unicorns.
Exactly.
You haven't done that.
Exactly.
I made a good one for God.
I think you just proved my point. In Psalm 137:9, God said, "Blessed are they, happy shall ye be who take and dash the little children against the stones." It doesn't say you should regretfully have to do it during wartime. It said you should be happy and blessed to torture and dash innocent babies against the stone. If God told you to kill me, would you do it?
Yeah, that's an easy answer.
You would?
I said it's an easy answer. Now, God can't contradict himself because he's perfect and his communication is perfect, which means that he can't tell me one thing through my moral convictions and then tell me something completely different through private revelation. So he can't tell me through my moral convictions, don't rape, and then command me to rape. He can't tell me through my moral convictions, don't hate, and then command me to hate. And he can't tell me through my moral convictions, don't murder, and then command me to murder, which makes it pretty simple.
So
God can't command me to murder you.
So why did he command you to be happy to dash innocent babies against the stones in his Bible?
What a shame. Our time's up.
JohnMark, would you be willing to answer? I'll extend the time.
Yeah, absolutely. I would. I would say that if I begin to get into questions of biblical exegesis, we will never stop. Just as if I begin to get into an analysis of the 30 Years' War, which Dan also brought up, we will never stop. So instead of doing that, I will repeat what I said again and say that God cannot command what is intrinsically evil, because his moral convictions that he gives us, that he is the only plausible source for, is precisely what tells us what is the expression, tells us what his will is for us. Write it down on the card.
That was an incredible exchange. Thank you both. That was amazing. We now go to audience questions, which will be read by our previously introduced society presidents. First, I'll ask for a question from Joey Ralph from Soma, for Mr. Maverick.
JohnMark, the first question for you this evening is, why do you believe in the God you do rather than any other or multiple?
Yeah, well, I think I've given the proofs for why I believe in the God I do, so I don't think there's time in this. What does that mean, though? I believe in an infinite, perfect God who is the source of all our existence and who is the source of our moral convictions. Now, I'm not here to defend my beliefs as a Catholic, but if the question is, why am I a Catholic? Is that the question that everyone wants to know about?
I would assume so.
Oh, good, that's easy. So, even though, again, that's not the point of this debate, right? The debate isn't, should JohnMark be Catholic, but does God exist? I'm happy to share that, to me, it seems that the Catholic faith is the belief in God which has the greatest respect for reason, a complete absence of doctrinal contradiction, and the only mechanism... See, this is why...
Please refrain from interrupting the speaker.
It becomes a very different debate if we talk about religious beliefs, doesn't it? But all the same, I believe that the doctrinal history of the Church, and I'd be very, very happy to talk to any of you about it. I work at the St. Lawrence Center here on campus. The Catholic doctrine has a complete absence of inherent contradiction, internal contradiction. And lastly, it's the only religion I've ever seen with a mechanism for uniting all those who profess to believe in it. Thank you.
And something I'll offer to both of you as well. If you would like to offer a thought on that question, I'll give you 30 seconds.
Just briefly, every religion contains within itself a mechanism for uniting the followers of that religion. So that's no big plus for Catholicism.
From St. Thomas, please.
Mr. Barker, you stated in your argument that we received our morality from our ancestors. Where did our ancestors receive their morality?
Yeah, I didn't say we received our morality from our ancestors. I said, as Thomas Jefferson said, that we do have moral instincts, some instincts. And as I clearly said in my statement, which JohnMark ignored, there is a solid natural basis for those instincts, and that is survival. Our ancestors made decisions that led to a greater chance that they would survive and have offspring. The ones who made poor decisions, not just ours, but any species on the planet, the ones who made poor decisions did not pass on that tendency to the same degree as those who made good survival decisions. Therefore, you and I are here as a result of an unbroken chain of successful ancestors who made decisions, or at least that were lucky enough to avoid harm. So survival is a harm question, and they survived harm and were able to reproduce, and we inherited that. That's part of our moral instinct. It's not the whole thing, because we have a frontal lobe now that has evolved more recently, which checks, which is more of a moral or social checking. The frontal lobe is the part of your body that's keeping you from burping out loud right now, or farting in this audience. You know what I mean? Maybe you want to, but wait, I'm checking. That's part of a natural process of the brain that we inherited from ancestors. So we don't get all of our moral decisions from our ancestors, but we do have instincts, and so do other animals. So do chimpanzees, so do whales, so do dolphins, so do they sacrifice and cooperate. We are a social species. And it made more sense for our ancestors to survive by cooperating as a social species than not. So we inherited from those ancestors of ours those natural biological instincts as the natural biological organisms that we are, which nudge us toward actions that on balance, it's not perfect, but on balance, increases the likelihood that we will survive and avoid harm in the real world. The other step is to use reason, if you don't have a clear answer, use reason to evaluate the consequences, because morality is just a question of harm. That's all it is, real harm. It's not a real harm for John to feel nervous about a debate. That's not a harm. The harm would be if he tripped and hurt himself because he was so scared. That's where the harm comes from, in which case I would hope to catch you when you were falling, as a naturally evolved human being.
Thank you. Do you care to respond?
Yeah, I'd catch you too, Dan. And also, certainly a desire for survival is not necessarily a source of morality, because I could try to kill someone so I could harvest their organs for myself to survive. That would be bad. In terms of survival of the species, we have no idea what contributes to the survival of the species. We're not all demographers or evolutionary populationists or anything like that. So what does that leave us with? Well, it leaves us with instincts. And some instincts are good, and some instincts are bad. So those obviously aren't either the source of morality, because I may have an instinct to beat the tar out of the guy who cuts in front of me at the checkout line, and that's an instinct I should resist. So neither survival of the species, nor survival of the individual, nor instincts can possibly be the source of our understanding of what is right and wrong.
Thank you. Next question from someone.
All right, JohnMark, I'll briefly preface this with saying that we received a high volume of questions dealing with the creation of evil, existence of evil, whatnot.
Oh, yes.
And so I'll just keep that in mind with this particular question. It's the best example that we found. If God exists, then does the devil also exist? And if so, did God essentially create evil?
Great, good question. Again, I think it's pretty simple, right? Why is it evil? Why is it suffering? Well, we've proven that God can't be the source of evil and suffering because he's infinitely perfect. And we know from experience that we are capable of doing evil things which sometimes result in suffering even of the innocent. So, philosophically, not religiously speaking here, what we can say is that the existence of evil and the suffering of the innocent in the world must, by reason, be attributed to us or to things like us, who are capable of making evil decisions and initiate suffering into the world. God can't, based on the logical proofs we've given, be the source of evil. What's left? Well, our experience tells us.
Well, I would say briefly that in the Bible that you claim to believe has no contradictions, God very clearly claimed in Isaiah 45:7, I created evil. The Hebrew word there is ra. The Hebrew word for create is bara. So God admits that he created evil. How could evil exist unless God created it? So according to your Bible, evil is something that God created. But you said during your rebuttal, God cannot command what is intrinsically evil. How does anyone know? How does even God know what is intrinsically evil? Morality means getting along and avoiding dangers and threats and harms. That's what morality means. If the word morality just means obeying orders, then nothing is right and nothing is wrong except what God decrees, which is why I asked you, if God told you to kill me, if he did, I'm not saying that he would or wouldn't, if he did, would you do it? A command theory of morality from a God who doesn't even give his reasons for what is intrinsically good or evil is not even a moral being itself. We all possess within ourselves a natural feeling of those things that are likely to cause harm and are likely to avoid harms. That's what we would call relative to our species intrinsically evil. God cannot be the source of that because he's not a physical being like we are.
Thank you. The next question will be from St. Thomas. JohnMark, you will have an additional 45 seconds to respond. Please.
Mr. Barker, this question asks, how did something come from nothing?
I have a whole chapter on that in my next book that's coming out, but basically, science shows that something does come from nothing. If nothing is defined, first, nothing really can't be defined, and John touched on that actually quite eloquently earlier, that nothingness can't even be defined because you're defining something if you're defining nothingness. So even if there is a God, there had to be something. There always had to be something if there is a God. So somethingness is a brute fact. But we know from science that in the complete vacuum of space where there is no matter at all, we do see the creation of virtual particles and antiparticles, which occasionally results in the creation of, when one of them might separate, like at the event horizon of a black hole, one of them might go this way. You do see actually the creation of something from nothing in the actual universe of ourselves. But it depends how you define nothing. There was quantum potential there, obviously. But if there's a God sitting over here, here's God and he's something, and over there is nothingness? Are you picturing some kind of a cosmos where there's this being who's everything, and suddenly over there's this nothingness? What is that nothingness from which this God somehow decided to create something? That's an incoherent concept. Unless you define nothingness in terms of somethingness, you're asking a question that doesn't even have any meaning to it.
I mean, yeah, I think the third proof answers the question. Something doesn't come from nothing. God is the infinite being, which means, again, there is no nothing, which means that our something, our existence, our reality, is where God shares his reality with us in constituting us. So there's no logical problems there. And to say that something can come from nothing, right? Scientists love to talk about emergence, especially atheistic scientists. And emergence is kind of like saying a rabbit emerges from a magician's hat. It doesn't really explain where the rabbit came from. And neither does it explain how things came to be and how something greater can come from something lesser. There's got to be rabbits where the rabbit came from. I would say there's got to be intelligence and life at the source of the intelligence and life that we see around us.
We have time for one more set of questions.
All right, JohnMark, like I said before, I'll briefly preface this. We did receive a high volume of questions referring to your personal beliefs. And to tie it back to the debate, we believe that this was the best question. Do you consider the Bible in its entirety essential to your belief of God or non-essential? And if so, how do you deal with the issues of certain things that may be immoral, such as the fact that women are possessions or child abuse in the Bible?
Yeah, good, thanks. And thanks for using essential and non-essential. It's nice when you use my terms, very cool. Again, this is my personal belief, so what I say, whether you agree with it or not, doesn't affect the arguments that we've shown that prove that God exists. But all the same, I'm happy to share my beliefs. And that is, as a Catholic, that the Bible is essential. It's in the sense that it's indispensable, but it sure isn't sufficient. G.K. Chesterton said that the Bible smasher is just the Bible worshiper turned upside down. I don't worship the Bible. I don't think it's enough. The Catholic Church has never thought it's enough. Those texts need to be interpreted very, very carefully by a competent authority. I think Dan has shown compellingly to me that we ourselves as individuals are not a competent authority. We make all kinds of mistakes. We're all kinds of fallible. So it seems to me that if the Bible is true, and I think it is, there has got to be something else, some other mechanism that's also true that can help us make sense of it. And that's why I think the Bible requires a belief in the pontifical magisterium. Okay.
Do you care to respond?
Only that I used to believe the Bible was reliable, and I preached it, and I based my life on it. But I now know that it's not. It's internally contradictory, it is unscientific, it is unhistorical. There is some truth in the Bible, but on balance, it's not a reliable guide for truth or for morality. The moral teachings that are in the Bible, as some of you are pointing out here, we would lock that being up if he lived in the same neighborhood with us. I wouldn't want to live in the same neighborhood with that God who commits and commands and condones the mass killings and the discrimination of women and the beating of slaves and so on. It is a morally bankrupt and horrible book, and you should be ashamed of yourself to consider it a part of your religion. It is not a source of morality or reliable truth.
All right, last question. Mr. Barker, we got a lot of these, so we decided to ask you this. What evidence of God would be, and would it have to be something that everyone would agree on for you to believe in it?
Yeah, atheism is exquisitely falsifiable. If Jesus were to materialize here on this stage in front of us and we captured it on videotape, if Jesus would just answer his own promise that all things whatsoever you shall ask for in prayer believing you shall receive, or the prayer of faith will heal the sick. If he would just answer his own promises and keep his own promises, that would be strong evidence. If God were to tell JohnMark knows this God personally apparently. If God were to tell JohnMark that tomorrow at 12:13 and 7 seconds, a meteorite from the south-southwest weighing 14 ounces would penetrate this building and end up 12 inches below the basement of this building, composed of 40% iron and 3% iridium and so on. And if tomorrow that actually happens, I would say, all right, Where do I send my check?
Yeah, I thought, first of all, it was interesting. He spent half the question talking about what it would take to make him believe in Jesus, which certainly wasn't the question. And then the second part saying it would take some sort of prediction to confirm his belief in God, some sort of improbable prediction, which I think is strange because I'm sure that we could interpret my prediction of some improbable event, like a specific form of meteorite crash, in some other way than God's existence. I have to say, it seems to me that my proofs are actually much stronger than the proof that Dan is looking for. So I'm happy to see that.
That's all we have time for questions. We will have a closing statement from each, and then a brief announcement, and we'll close. For the first closing statement, this is Dan Barker. Please keep it to 3 minutes if you can.
I think John's biggest blunder tonight was the sentence that existence is a non-essential feature. Existence is not a feature, it is not a characteristic. He's playing with words. Theologians like to do that. Christian apologists like to equivocate. They like to pretend that in the ontological argument, Anselm did the same thing. Anselm, who said that a being who exists is greater than a being who's just in conception, as if existence were somehow a characteristic of something that already exists. That's gobbledygook. That is nonsense. It's an argument that has no meaning to it at all. Again, John is confusing God of the gap explanations for evidence. It is not evidence. Was the thunder and lightning evidence for Thor? Was that plastic bottle evidence for unicorns? Obviously not. To posit some kind of an explanation for the existence of these things is simply a positing, and is not evidence itself. It is trying to argue. You're trying to take a gap in our understanding and plug it with your theory, with your hypothesis, which you can't even define. You can't tell us what it's made of. You can't tell us what it's what would be how would you know that it doesn't exist? What sentence could you possibly say about your God which, if true, would make your claim that he exists untrue? How would you falsify such a claim? And if you can't, in principle, create a falsifiable statement, then you're not even arguing for anything that we can talk about. We're not sinking our teeth into anything. I do want to close with just a tiny little atheist sermon. If life is eternal, then life is cheap. We give greater value to things that are rare, things that are precious. Rare metals and precious. We mourn the death of old people, but when a young child dies, whoa, we think it's a greater loss. We atheists and agnostics know that this life is all there is. This is all we have. And because of that, our life is enhanced to a much greater degree. Our appreciation, our enjoyment, our respect for that life is enhanced. So I have not heard any evidence for a God. I haven't heard any good arguments for a God. I've heard a lot of words. I've heard some equivocations. I've heard some bad definitions. So in my mind, why believe in something that is so irrational and delusional? Why not spend our energy and our time not giving money and time and energy to some church or some religion, but actually doing real good in the real world? There's no purpose of life. That's the truly good news. If there were a purpose of life, that would cheapen life as well. As long as there are problems to solve and the truly moral issues that we're struggling with and solving the real problems of society and the world, hunger and inequality and oppression and you name it, as long as there are those problems to solve, there is immense purpose in life. So we atheists and agnostics reject the notion of this creator God, but we heartily embrace morality, goodness, beauty, and purpose. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I'm very happy with the way tonight's debate has gone. Dan kind of ended by accusing me of playing with words, which I think you'll find an argument is usually something your opponent does when he can't find a flaw in your argument, but he doesn't like the conclusion. Dan asked, what would falsify my belief in God? I'll tell you, based on the three proofs again, which were barely touched upon. The first proof means that if no reality existed, if nothing in the world, if the natural world didn't exist, I might lose my belief in God. If someone could prove to me that nothing was right and wrong, I might lose my belief in God. If someone, based on the third proof, could show that illogicity was possible, if someone could show me a round square, I might lose my faith in God. That shows how difficult your case is and how strong mine is. I'd like to end with this. There's been a lot of citation from the Bible tonight, so maybe I'll be excused one citation, which is from the 2nd chapter of the book of Jeremiah, where there's a complaint made against those pagans who say to a piece of wood, "You are my father," and who say to a rock, "You gave birth to me." And of course, that's a very irrational, very primitive, very superstitious worldview. But what's interesting to me is that the pseudo-scientific atheism that Dan represents tonight is superstitious and irrational for precisely the same reason. In fact, the only thing that's changed is that the idols have gotten smaller. Instead of saying to a piece of wood, "You are my father," they say it to the molecular life forms of the world. Instead of saying to a rock, "You brought me into the world, you gave birth to me," they say that to the inanimate, unintelligent subatomic particles. And while that view of things may have grown more sophisticated, may have grown more complex, and I think it's certainly grown more dogmatic and more evangelical, the one thing it can never become and will never become is any more rational. Thanks so much, and God bless.